1978, after he had moved out of his CMHC program, he said, "In short, it seems clear that community mental health centers cannot now and will not in the near future be able to do what the legislation requires, that failure is inevitable and that the cost of this failure may be severe," as it has been on it. So, what did Saul do? Like many of the others who came out of NIMH at that time, he moved into the private sector. He became president and CEO of Health America Corporation of California, CEO of United Behavioral Health, a leading provider of emotional wellness services, also specialized in denying hospitalization to people who need it. The chairman, I don't know what Saul was making, but his boss in 2000 was making $54.1 million at that time. And I think Saul's done very well because the San Francisco Chronicle announced a few years ago that he was living in a penthouse atop the Four Seasons Hotel. Now, I don't know how many of you live there, but it's quite nice. As the Chronicle said, ultra wealthy, enjoy living in luxury above it all. It advertised itself as panoramic, sweeping views of the Yerba Buena Gardens and south the San Francisco Bay. The top penthouse is 2,300 square feet, exactly the size of my house, I might add. And it costs $8,000 a day. So anyway, that's Saul. So what you had was a series of administrators who didn't do what they should when it was very clear that this program was failing. And it was clear 30 years ago it was failing. And it's even clearer today. Finally, the third person I just want to talk about in background is Michael Bowers. And Carla can't answer, but does anybody else know who Michael Bowers is? That's interesting. Kind of lost to history. Well, I'll remind you. Michael Bowers was actually a very interesting fellow, born in Pittsburgh, moved to California as a child, worked as a sound man in concert halls and as a chauffeur, but also developed schizophrenia. Age 24, developed paranoid schizophrenia, thought that high-level officials wanted to keep him from revealing secret information. He thought he was king of the New World Order. He thought he had predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall and the O.J. Simpson trial. And from 1986 to 2001, for 11 of the 15 years, he was either in Patton State Hospital or Atascadero State Hospital or prison. When in the community, he refused to take medications, of course. When he was on medications, he was described as charming and funny and enjoyable. Very functional when he was on medication, but there was nothing wrong with him, so why should he take medications? So when he was off medications, he finally got sick and tired of the Department of Mental Health and Patton State Hospital in Atascadero. And also he decided to send a message, and he sent a very clear message. And this was the message he sent. He got in his 18-wheeler filled with condensed milk, going 70 miles an hour through the streets of Sacramento, up 50 yards over the yard of the lawn of the state capitol, and up the steps trying to go through the door into the state capitol. But when you're bouncing in an 18-wheeler over those steps, you get a little off center, so he hit the wall just to the side of the door. My theory is that he was trying to go through the door, and Gray Davis's office was 30 yards away. My theory also, he was looking for Steve Mayberg's office, and once he got inside, he'd probably ask directions on it. Of course, the truck exploded. He was killed. But this is the kind of message that they did here. Ironically, the next morning, and this is a real irony, his body is still in the truck. And yet, because it was all burned and they were doing investigations of all that, but over his body in the hearing room just above it, they had the pre-scheduled meeting, hearings on the quality of inadequacy of psychiatric care in state prisons. There's something really nice about that, of having that hearing while Mr. Bowers is still beneath them, burned to death, trying to give a message. Now, 6 days earlier, Scott Thorpe had killed Laura Wilcox in Nevada County. And there had been an AOT, now called Laura's Law, hanging around, going nowhere. But after Mr. Bowers attempted to drive his truck into the state capitol, suddenly people became much more interested in it. And between the death of Laura Wilcox and the Thorpe, who killed 2 other people at the same time, and I kind of consider Bowers and Thorpe between them as co-fathers of Laura's Law. Okay, so what's all this led to? Well, it's led to a disaster, which you all know or you wouldn't be here today. But I'd like to emphasize, first of all, that for about half the people that came out of the hospitals, they have done better than they might have. These are the people who had family support. These are the people who are aware of their illness. Roughly 50% of the people with schizophrenia are aware of their illness. Maybe 50 to 60% of people with bipolar with psychotic features, they tend to do better. Some of them will stay on their medicine no matter what because they know they need it. And so I'm not downplaying the fact that there's a group that is better off, but at least half of them clearly are worse off on it. And let's talk about the various groups. One are the groups who have been victimized and prematurely dead on it. Let me add also that when you're looking at this history, and it's really a fascinating history if you like these kinds of things, you don't see the real disaster in the first 10 years after we started deinstitutionalizing, because the least sick patients are the ones that were deinstitutionalized first. The people, and I saw this working in St. Elizabeth's in Washington as well, the people who still had family contacts, the people who were kind of good patients on the ward, easy to place. So these aren't the ones that ended up with the disasters. As we've gone on with time and deinstitutionalized more and more of the sickest and the sickest patients, and now of course we don't deinstitutionalize at all. You can't get them in the hospital in the first place. So when you look at this history, you look and say, well, you know, for the first 10 years it didn't look that bad. Didn't look that bad because the least sick patients were coming out. But then we started to get into the problems of the 80s, and you're really starting to see things go down in the 80s. Victimization, individuals in LA group homes, 2/3 reporting having been robbed and assaulted during the last year. San Francisco, one of the shelters, I know one woman who has been raped 17 times. This is certainly consistent with the work I did in shelters in Washington. 2006, 308 seriously mentally ill individuals in the previous 6 months. 26% had been robbed, raped, mugged, or assaulted. That work was done by Mary Castle White and her group at the UCSF School of Nursing. And also in that study, it was very clear that those who were much more likely to have been raped or robbed or mugged or assaulted were those who were sicker. Surprise, surprise, exactly what you would expect on it. We also know death rates of people with schizophrenia in particular are about, many say 25 years less than should be normally, 1/3 by suicides and accidents, 2/3 from untreated physical illnesses on it. And since we're talking about the future, what can we expect on victimization? If things continue the way they are, we can expect more individuals being assaulted, more individuals robbed, more women raped. And in my mind, as I've said many times, I think it's absolutely inhumane to put people who are unaware of their illness living on the streets, especially women. As a judge in Massachusetts said, they are like rabbits forced to live in the company with dogs on it. And I think it's something that we all have to be very aware of, that is a horrendous problem. Homeless problem, nothing new on this. Very prophetically today when we came and the policeman opened the door and he said, opened the door to the auditorium here, and he said, you know, give me a call if you have any problem with homeless people. And I said, that's very nice. We have lots of problems with homeless people. Most of them are seriously mentally ill. That's not what he was referring to. Homelessness became a severe problem in the 80s. California State Assemblyman Bruce Bronston estimated that there were between 20,000 and 50,000 adults who were chronically mentally ill and maybe homeless, a situation he labeled as morally unacceptable and just unbelievable. Dick Lamb, who I have great respect for in LA, one of the California psychiatrists who has really tried to do everything he can at it. Probably nothing more graphically illustrates the problem of deinstitutionalization than the shameful and incredible phenomenon of the homeless mentally ill. In LA in 1985, study reported 30 to 50% of the homeless persons were seriously mentally ill, and they were seen, quote, in ever-increasing numbers. The studies noted, quote, they are defenseless and frequently victimized, beaten, robbed, and raped daily, and often eat garbage and sleep in alleyways. The study concluded that homeless mentally ill people are in part the product of deinstitutionalization movement, and that, quote, the new liberalized mental health laws, read LPS, making involuntary treatment almost impossible. The streets have become the asylums of the 80s. One of the most telling stories was the 88 study in LA. 529 Los Angeles street persons, 44% had a previous psychiatric hospitalization. Among that group, 28% obtained some food from garbage cans, and 8% utilized garbage cans as their primary food source. I want to just say as an aside, I spent 2 years in Ethiopia, and one of my Ethiopian colleagues who had never been to the States came to the States and was going to stay with us, but he was in town for 2 days before we came back. And the first thing he said was, because he was staying downtown, he said, what are all these homeless people doing here? He said, we've seen this in Ethiopia. And I thought, this is a very nice commentary on where we are. Another study of the mentally ill street persons found that 79% of them had been previously psychiatric hospitalized. 1989 in San Francisco, the TV station here had a big signboard, quote, you are now walking through America's newest mental institution. LA, Major Villagrosa, visited Skid Row in 2005, says, I mean, it almost looked like Bombay or something except with more violence. There is no place in the city where the chaos and degradation are as pronounced. You see a complete breakdown of society on it. The LA Times called the Skid Row scene a human catastrophe unfolding, and concluded that laws intended to protect the rights of mentally ill persons are well-intended but inhumane. In 1976, Mike Ryoko, who is the Chicago, now deceased columnist, making fun of California, called California the world's largest outdoor mental asylum. Now, he was being facetious at the time. It's actually now become true. You know all this. You've had Operation Scrub Down and Care Not Cash, none of which seems to have made very much difference on it, and won't make much difference until you attack the real core of the problem, and that is people need treatment. And if they're not being treated, then they're going to end up homeless. The future, you're going to see more homelessness on the streets. You say, well, we can't see more. Well, you know, they said that in the late 80s, they said that in the mid-90s, they said that 10 years ago, and each time we've seen more. And I guarantee you, you can see more, and you will see more. And at the rate of closing down beds and closing down outpatient facilities, you definitely will see more. The question is how high it will get. You're also going to see more crime. 1983 study showed that homeless persons with a previous psychiatric hospitalization had 3 times more felony convictions than homeless persons without a previous psychiatric hospitalizations. And the question is kind of an intriguing question of how bad does the homelessness situation have to get before the city council will act or before the officials will act. And I don't know the answer to it. I do know that in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a classic liberal university town and had very liberal laws, the homeless mentally ill started to take over right downtown is where the mayor's office is, and they started to wander in the mayor's office. And suddenly the mayor said, well, wait a minute, maybe these laws aren't quite the way we wanted them. And so they went back and started to redo things. But that's what it took in Madison, is the homeless actually coming in and sitting down in the mayor's office on it. Next